and good afternoon. It's wonderful to see you all. Let's see. It's great to see you all. Welcome to our audience, and a very special welcome to the extraordinary former Assistant Secretary of Homeland Security, Juliette Kayyam, and our outstanding moderator, Warren Olney. Our topic for tonight seems particularly appropriate in light of today being Pearl Harbor Day and today's arrest of a group of extremists in Germany who fought to overthrow the German government. More about that in a minute from my partner, David. America at a Crossroads is a joint venture between Jews United for Democracy and Justice and Community Advocates, Inc. Thanks, as always, to our leadership team, which in addition to me includes David Lehrer, former Congressman Mel Levine, Xavier Oslavsky, Rabbi Ken Chazen, and Caroline Kelly. There is a change for next week's program that some of you may have just been informed about this afternoon. We learned today that Robin Wright, who is to be our speaker next week on the subject of the revolution in Iran, needed to reschedule her evening with us. But luckily, with the new Congress about to convene and the results of yesterday's Georgia Senate race, there's still a lot to talk about domestic politics. So next week, we will welcome the dynamic and brilliant duo of Bill Kristol and Ron Brownstein to help us make sense of our changing political landscape. They will be in conversation with Larry Mantle. Stay tuned for the registration link for the rescheduled Robin Wright program, which will be on February 1st. The following week, on December 21, you will have an opportunity to hear from Jim Rutenberg, longtime New York Times and New York Times Magazine investigative journalist. Jim has covered virtually every aspect and every level of government affairs in his career. In the last few years, he has conducted in-depth investigation on a number of subjects, one of which is the nullification by the U.S. Supreme Court of the Voting Rights Act, and he has extensively covered the rise of the fake facts movement embodied in Fox News and the Murdoch empire. Most recently, he wrote an extensive expose which appeared in the November 2nd, 2022 issue of the New York Times magazine, which details Russia's meddling in Trump-era politics, and disturbingly, the highly suspicious connections between Trump campaign officials at the very highest levels and Putin's top-level confidants. You don't want to miss hearing from Jim Rutenberg, who will be in conversation with the always incisive Pat Morrison. If you are not signed up to be on our America Crossroads email list, so you get announcements of all of our program with links, etc. If you're not signed up on the list, you don't get the emails. And if you want to unsubscribe from our list, you won't get the emails. So if you need to resubscribe, let me know. We do have closed captioning. You have to enable that from your end. We'll put a note in the chat as to how to do that. And again, it's wonderful to be here tonight. And now please welcome my colleague, David Lehrer. David.
Thank you, Janice. It is indeed wonderful to be here. If it's Wednesday night, it's time for America at a Crossroads. I'm looking forward to tonight's program. There aren't many issues more important than the threats to our democracy, domestic and foreign. Today's headlines, as Janice mentioned, about a coup plot in Germany with allegations of a deep state is shockingly reminiscent of what we've been hearing from the likes of Trump buddy Steve Bannon for the past 7 years. Juliette Kayyam is a maven on that and related subjects. Our upcoming programs, after the two that Janice mentioned, will feature New York Times columnist David Brooks in conversation with the LA Times Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist Pat Morrison. That'll be on January 4th. The following week, we host a timely panel on China and the challenges that the regime is facing and what it means for the rest of the world. We have noted China expert Ming-Tsin Pei from Claremont McKenna College and Stanford's expert on democracy studies and governance, Larry Diamond. Subsequent weeks will bring us Ambassador Dennis Ross to talk about the Middle East, Iran's nuclear program, Israel, and its new government, followed by former ambassador to Moscow, Stanford's Mike McFaul. He's head of the renowned Freeman Spogli Institute there. He was a diplomat that Putin wanted Trump to return to Moscow for interrogation when they met in Helsinki. It's now my pleasure to introduce our frequent moderator, the recipient of dozens of awards for broadcast excellence on television and radio, my friend Warren Olney. I know that Warren has been looking forward to this interview because there is so much to discuss and so much to learn. Warren?
David, thank you so much. Juliette Kayyam's latest book is called The Devil Never Sleeps, Learning to Live in an Age of Disasters. And sure enough, when disasters occur, Juliette Kayyam is a very familiar presence. She's on CNN, she's in the Atlantic, she's on Twitter, she's all over the place providing advice on disaster management, on accountability. That's an interesting issue, and on how to do better next time. For 20 years, she has worked in government, in academia, and in the private sector. She was Assistant Secretary for Homeland Security, as was mentioned a moment ago, in the Obama administration. She is a lecturer on international security at the Kennedy School. She's also CEO of a company called Grip Mobility. Those are just the highlights. There are several other books, as well as the one I mentioned, even including short stories in a book called These Precious Days. And Juliette Kayyam, I love that touch. It's a precious day when you're with us. Thanks for being here tonight.
Unmute myself. Thank you so much, Warren. It is a thrill to be here. Warren and I have been talking for many years through, I think, since 9/11, and have gotten to know his daughter and granddaughter here in Massachusetts. So this is like a homecoming of sorts. So, and I grew up in LA, so I am glad to be connected to LA through this. So thank you so much.
Okay, I just want to say hello to the audience as well, and remind you that if you text your questions to David Lehrer, you can do that. He will then text them to me, and after I ask questions for a half hour or so, I'll put those to Juliette Kayyam, and we get some good questions out of you guys, so I'm looking forward to that.
Yes.
So, Juliette Kayyam, you have addressed yourself to many kinds of disaster, including acts of domestic terror. Today in Germany, an act of that kind might well have been prevented. More than 20 people were arrested there, another 20 are suspected of plotting to overthrow the government and install a new one. Now, here's what you tweeted about it today. I want our viewers to hear this. A headline should scream that these dozens of people were all actually part of a right-wing effort aligned with a similar global accelerationist ideology, including QAnon and the anti-deep state movement. So you're taking this very seriously, and I want you to elaborate on what you tweeted and tell us more.
Yes, well, thank you, and thank you for the audience, for everyone joining in from amazing places, and places that I welcome being invited to, like Hawaii and Australia, in the months, winter months ahead. So I take it seriously, and I am a big proponent in the way I write and talk and think about disasters or the challenges that we face, of sort of truth in advertising. It strikes me as a weird thing for major media institutions to simply reflect that 25 guys were arrested for a potential coup, and not to focus on what the ideology is. The first chapter in my book is called "Get Your Head Around It." In some ways, we're sometimes afraid to go there, to say what it is. Is Donald Trump the head of a domestic terrorism movement? Was that actually an insurrection? We take too long. So I was very frustrated at essentially a day long of coverage that was benign in what was animating what we now know to animate this coup attempt. We don't know the details, how successful it is, but what we do know is it represents a global phenomenon of an anti-democratic movement coming from the right wing, coming from right-wing groups. This group appears to have two different ties. One is QAnon, and QAnon is wacky and weird. It's also dangerous. And so I sort of view QAnon as sort of the quicksand into a very, very dangerous world. Some people stay at the top level where they're just sort of wacky, but lots of people fall into the rabbit hole or the quicksand and become violent. We certainly know that from a number of cases. So there's one stream of sort of radicalization coming out of QAnon. The other is coming out of a German flavor of that, which is a right-wing group that is actually tied to the monarchy, and one of the members is a great grandson or grandson of the former German monarchs. They do not view democracy as a legitimate form of government, so they are anti-democratic, anti-elections, and they are animated by this idea of the deep state, that these are not. So this should sound familiar to everyone, that these are not legitimate governments that are elected by people. I don't know how far along the planning was. It's a great disruption by Germany. Germany is a complicated country. We all know that. I don't mean that benignly. I just mean in terms of its surveillance capabilities, its its laws are much more pro-privacy than ours. These are not easy investigations in the United States. They are even harder in Germany. So this was a great series of arrests. Last thing I'll say is at least one of the members is a Russian national. So they will be looking to any ties to Russia, as we certainly know is true here with a lot of the radicalization.
You think any of these people have military training?
Yeah. So really, so some of them must be older, because at least in the initial reports, it shows or says that some of them have got training in the army in East Germany. Even if they were very young, we're still putting them in their late 40s, mid 50s. Others, we believe, or at least what I've seen, may have gotten more recent military training. This is not uncommon, as we've seen, for example, the head of the Proud Boys, who just recently was found guilty for seditious conspiracy. He had military training. We certainly know a large number of the January 6th folks are. We know former members of the military, leaders in QAnon. So this is not surprising that kind of radicalization can feed in military or more conservative communities that where it's allowed to fester.
In your tweet, you use the term accelerationist.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
So accelerationist is a theory of, let's say, a theory of coup, a theory of insurrection, of which these groups want to accelerate the demise of democracy, but they don't view it as a democracy. They view us as illegitimate representatives. In other words, because either the country's too diverse, it's not reflecting their viewpoints. So there's one way to create connective tissue amongst all these different groups is that within them, each of them has an accelerationist belief that their violence, their planning, their threats of violence can accelerate the natural order of things, which is their establishment of whatever kind of government they believe is legitimate. This is very, very similar to what Trump was doing, both indirectly and then quite directly leading up to January 6th, throughout his whole administration, essentially trying to accelerate the demise of the peaceful transition of power. That is essentially what Trump was about, was undermining that.
How concerned are you? What do you think is the impact of Trump's involvement with QAnon?
So I'm a little counterintuitive on this. I've been writing about it for a long time for The Atlantic. Essentially, my first big piece after January 6th was we have to treat the Trump movement as a terrorism movement. It is. You can call it an insurgency movement. You can call it an insurrection. Those words are somewhat meaningless in terms of what tools do we have. And I really was focused. I started my career in counterterrorism, really focused on the tools of counterterrorism, and that those would provide a great model for thinking about what are you trying to do? You are trying to minimize the impact and the power of the leader and his movement. So I talk about this in the book. You measure success not by eradication. These bad philosophies are going to exist for a long time. It's whether those ideologies find it harder to grow, to raise money, to get recruits, to be established, and can you continue to minimize their influence so that something like, for example, just as an example, Nazism doesn't die, right? It still has remnants, but its ability to grow, one hopes, has been made harder over the decades for 10,000s of reasons. But part of it is the social shaming of what that means. So what are those counterterrorism efforts? The first is deplatforming the leader, isolating him through the litigation, through getting him off of social media. All of those were important. The second is, of course, going after the money. The third is going after the troops. I think the couple hundred of cases against the January 6th people, whether they ended up in jail or just got a fine or 30 days, or the more significant ones, the 5 to 6 years ones, and maybe even more now, all are helpful. And then you make it hard for these groups to grow. So the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, these are essentially dead organizations right now. Their leadership has turned on each other. We know that they are testifying against each other. It is very hard for terrorist organizations across the board, whether you're talking about Islamic terrorism, domestic terrorism, they succeed and grow, and your focus is on getting them not to grow, by the narrative of the win, right? ISIS did this, that's how they recruited. And when they start to lose, they lose land, their leadership is in jail. It is very hard for them to recruit new people and to raise fees. These groups get money from their membership. And so I think these are all important efforts. It doesn't, I guess I'll end with this. I think a lot of critics of Trump and what's happening in this country, sort of want that moment, right? He's walking in an orange jumpsuit. And I think of it a little bit differently, which is there's 1,000 ways to get this movement to implode, be isolated, not gain strength, be shamed, not win elections, all of those things. And there are some good metrics out there in that regard. I mean, there's not like one fell swoop. It is a 1,000 cuts.
I want to ask you about a very disturbing event that's going on here in the United States right now in North Carolina. But before I do, just quickly about President Trump. You said he's associated with a terrorist organization. That's tough language for a former president of the United States. Do you think he'll be regarded as a loser as a result of what's happened in the recent elections? And are you confident that he will then begin to lose the power that he has?
Yes, this is the narrative that we wanted right now, which is the consistent losses. You then create a off-ramp for people who might have supported him, and they begin an off-ramp. This is what's so interesting in some of the reading I was reading today about Reverend Warnock, about his campaign. They understood that they had to create an off-ramp from Governor Kemp, a very popular Republican governor in Georgia, to them. They weren't going to do it by saying, you're all horrible people, even if you might think that, or, and Warnock certainly would have a reason to, because there's a lot of racial animus against him, and to create those off-ramps. I think the January 6th committee has helped create some off-ramps for people. It's playing out in the elections by purposefully only having Republicans testify. That was a sort of come hither. You don't want to be the last one on the ship. Now, does it work? We don't know. I often say, I don't know how this ends, but if I'm judging different metrics over the last 2 years, I certainly like these metrics than the alternative. And I think that's good. It's going to be up to the Republican Party to make sure they don't run 80 people against Trump, and then he gets the nomination because, 20% of the party voted for him.
Okay, so nothing happened in Germany. These people were arrested, but they hadn't done anything yet. Now we have the situation in this country. We have 2 electric substations run by Duke Energy in North Carolina, shot up and disabled last Saturday night. And people have described this as a little bit like what it's like in the Ukraine, because the electricity is gone. People are in dark shelters. Businesses have closed down. We don't know how long that's going to last. It's going to be extraordinarily expensive to fix it. And the people involved, the law enforcement people, the Duke Energy people, are saying that these were people who really knew what they were doing. They knew how to disable these power stations with high-powered weapons. And what's fascinating about this is that the same thing happened in California in 2013. It is an incident that has never been solved. Nobody knows who did it. And there's a related incident in Ohio that has been associated with it, where 2 people pled guilty to plotting to do this.
Yes.
Do you see connections between all of these things, or do they concern you?
I'm not sure yet. I'll tell you what the connections are, is sort of increasing chatter. So 2013 might be the early stages of a very slow process, but certainly by 2020, increasing chatter in the right-wing circles about focusing on critical infrastructure in a way that was quite unsophisticated, but very easy. So in critical infrastructure, there's 16 critical infrastructure sectors in the United States. This is now me with my Homeland Security hat on. Critical infrastructure sectors.
That's what we're looking for.
Exactly. Well, it's, they're basically chemical industry, water, dams, transportation, emergency services, policing, and of course, the energy and electrical grid. Most of our, over 60% of our critical infrastructure is owned by the private sector. And as everyone knows, in California and Texas and now in North Carolina, these are monopolies. They are rich monopolies, but they are monopolies. There's not a lot of redundancy in the system. There's not a lot of customer choice. And these companies are not highly regulated. The government has set up some floors. So there are some requirements for some security, but and this is the theme, this is what I talk about in the book, the idea of safe is really not the way to think about a country like ours. We have to just think about safer, about minimizing risk and then minimizing the consequences when the devil comes again, right? The idea that the devil's not going to come again and again. And so the way to think about critical infrastructure and what's happening in North Carolina is the simple, what I describe in the book as left and right of boom, right? So your left of boom are all the things that you're doing that are about prevention, protection, stopping the bad thing from happening. But the boom will come, and it can be anything. It can be guys with guns. In California, it was scissors. It could be the hurricane, the tornado, the insurrection. And then what have you invested in right of boom to minimize the consequences, right? So because you can fail, as we say, you can fail safer if you're anticipating the boom. So what we have here is, I think, systems that are very vulnerable, and I think could be made less vulnerable, certainly not safe. In the case of substations, we know that concrete walls and sandbags basically can protect them from the kind of threat that is most likely, which is guns. We've seen this before, or shooting into them. The fact that the guys knew exactly where to shoot in two different locations does suggest a lot of planning, if not some insider knowledge. The challenge for us in this country, any country, is the right of boom, is that because there's no redundancies in the system, it just takes a long time to get them back up and running. We can do things better to build more resilient systems. We know that certainly with transportation, but we also have to live with the expectation that these things will happen. And then how would you want to have structured things, right? So, and this is how we think about infrastructure now. How would you want to minimize the consequences of the potential attack? Because you're not going to stop them all. That is a big challenge for this country, for any country, because you essentially have single points of failure in these systems, right? You bring down one substation, two substations, and tens of thousands of people are knocked off. And Duke Energy, which is a sophisticated company, is still going to take them a bunch of days. But that's what we're seeing. And when you ask me about the connectivity of these, since 2020, the right-wing organizations, anti-government organizations, have been focused on critical infrastructure for two reasons. One is they just like disruption. This is Steve Bannon. You don't have to have a reason. It is the disruption of the system is beneficial to them. The second, and this is very, very heinous in many ways, is there is a belief in the literature that if you turn the lights off, right, if people are children of the corn, right, they don't have the resources they need, that will start a race riot or a civil war, which they want. That our base instinct is to kill, right, if we're under threat. I mean, you can just imagine the kind of world that these people live in. What we see mostly in North Carolina, or any community that suffers something like that, is they actually tend to unify as they try to get back up to normal.
Well, let me ask you a couple of things. One is that when these guys can pled guilty in Ohio to very similar plots, they hadn't done anything, but the plots are exactly what we have seen in California and now again in North Carolina. They apparently had assigned each other different parts of the country where they would go and they would take out these substations. So that would suggest that there's a lot of thinking that has gone on behind this. Secondly, the warning about this came from the Department of Homeland Security in January of this year, when the first one occurred in 2013. Are we behind the curve?
Oh, well, actually, the DHS reissued, I'm sure it was just based on some chatter that they had, reissued that report, updated it the weekend before the North Carolina attacks, focusing on critical infrastructure, but also, and I know we'll get to this, the LGBTQ and and the Jewish community because of what we were
Yeah.
seeing in terms of Q Club and the Yay Twitter issues and the normalization of hate that's going on there. So on this, one thing when we look at connectivity, there's two ways to look at, are these things related? So one is, were they conspiring together? And this is the challenge of January 6th. Like, can you draw a line between the Oval Office and the guys out in the field? And I think that's a bad way to think about connectivity in our day and age. I have written one of my major pieces was called "There Are No Lone Wolves." We have to get that out of our head, that the way social media works and a society as ours is that they actually are part of a conspiracy. It's just the conspiracy isn't directed. It is part of a network of hate that finds itself, and then the algorithms help make it easier to find kin, so to speak, and they form the very community that used to be the KKK meeting at the back of the church in Jackson, Mississippi, right? So it's just a upgraded notion of what radicalization means, and this begins to gather lots of steam. This idea of radicalization in 2000 and on. Then in 2016, Donald Trump masters 2015 masters something that once again, I'm not shy about it, in terrorism circles is called stochastic terrorism. It is language used by a leader, Trump in this case, intended to incite, liberate Michigan, right? Good people on both sides, right? Whatever it is that he's saying, fight in the lead up to January 6th. Stop the steal. Think about that language. That language is stop. How are we supposed to stop the steal exactly? Like the language of incitement that will increase the likelihood of violence, even if what exactly happens isn't known or isn't directed by that person. So you're increasing the probability, but Trump isn't out there saying, somebody go kidnap Governor Whitmer in Michigan. That's stochastic terrorism. And then remember, it gives Trump, which the media was often happy to do, plausible deniability. He can then say, his people say, he was just kidding. Oh, you can't actually believe I meant that. This tactic was used throughout his presidency, and it's a way in which incitement occurs, but leadership can wipe their hands of it. And that's, excuse me, Warren, that is, I think, what's being exposed now in really great ways by some of these cases. I think the case against the leadership of the Oath Keepers exposed that, sort of said, you can't incite a riot and say, I didn't intend that exact thing to happen. You are responsible.
Well, if that's the case, then to what extent is it a good thing to arrest and to publicize and to let people know that there's an effort to put these people to enforce the law against them, even though they actually haven't done anything? And is that likely to slow things down, or will the news about it incite them even more?
I'm a big fan of the criminal case, if legitimate, not to silence free speech or anything. If look, prosecutors have to prove these cases. But one of the things that happened, for example, in the Oath Keepers case, is the prosecutor said you can't organize for ending the sort of peaceful transition of power and then wipe your hands clean when everyone who hears you rushes the Capitol, even if you weren't there. Remember, the leadership didn't walk into the Capitol building. Those are important ways of recognizing the way in which incitement works and the way in which the listener is hearing what the leadership wants. This is what Trump did. I mean, he did this for years. And I think part of what I try to do in the forums that I have is just sort of to explain it, but also to call it, right? And if you're constantly excusing it, it's a joke, he didn't mean it, he didn't really say that, right? What does he actually mean when he says these things? Well, don't try to parse his words. Understand what his listeners are hearing. Stop the steal, fight. It's going to be, a big event on January 6th, right? All the language is telling his listeners, right, that essentially, we've got to stop the steal. Now, how they decide to do it may not be on him directly, but his ability to politically wipe his hands clean of it is ridiculous. I think that's what the January 6th committee is exposing.
If you have people who know how to disable power substations and who are planning to do it, and you investigate them, to what extent are you going to be accused of interfering with their free speech rights, dealing with their privacy rights? It seems to me it's a very difficult issue for law enforcement to deal with.
It really is, and I'm not denying that. I mean, I think if you get to the stage of coordinating attacks, which the Ohio guys were, certainly the North Carolina guys, you sort of given up that free speech right, and certainly I think there's no dearth of opportunities for hate to fester in a First Amendment environment everywhere I look, right? I mean, it's like, the idea that somehow we're silencing the dialogue. Look, I mean, there's two things at play here, Warren. One is the market doesn't want it. So if you're thinking about social media, for example, one of the challenges that Elon Musk is going to have by getting rid of content control, it seems like he's his own content control, was that social media platforms that do not take seriously content control cannot get advertisers, because Ford Motors does not want an advertisement next to the Nazi club of Dubuque, Iowa. I mean, it's just, they don't want that, right? So the market is going to speak. And I think that's really important. I think that we shouldn't, that's actually a very good shaming aspect. And people will talk about cancel culture, okay. Like, it's like, yeah, call it what you want. I think it's actually a society that's matured past that hatred. The second thing that sort of is a protective thing is that these ideas continue to fester. I'm not against the MAGA. I'm against violent extremism. Once you focus on the violence part, separating the hate language from those who would actually organize or incite violence it's not easy, but it's easier than just saying, well, people just want to be icky people or have bad opinions. That's fine. It's the violence that then becomes the issue to focus on, actually, honestly.
Let's talk about a couple of the ideas that you have in the book, and they're relevant to what we've talked about, of course, given that's what the book is about. You talk about the preparedness paradox.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
So it's actually, so the book or I hope not trying, but is stories of disaster management that most people haven't heard. So some of it is the good news stories. I hope the book is actually hopeful and gives people agency that when things go right, because we always look at when things go wrong, but is also to take the surprise out of disaster management. We have a way of thinking about disasters and crises as surprises, and I think our lived experience should tell us otherwise, right? That and Warren, in the book, I open up, you can live in a field and never look up the word, right? So I finally looked up the word disaster. It's so obvious now, right? It's dis meaning not, and aster meaning misalignment of the stars. And so the belief had always been that, right, a disaster was put humankind in a passive position, and it was just, there, there, but for the grace of God go I, right? Those poor souls, because the stars were misaligned. I think that idea still captures us. I think in some ways we still are thinking of these as random and rare in terms of how we think about preparedness. And one of the challenges people like me who are big proponents of preparing for the boom moment is what you said is called the preparedness paradox. It comes out of actually the public health community, but was made famous, or a public health policy was made famous during Y2K. The preparedness paradox means that the more you put into being ready for the boom, the fewer consequences there will be. As I said, things will be less bad. That's my standard of success. And then it's harder to justify investments in being prepared, because everyone will say, what the heck were you worried about? So Y2K is a perfect example. United States takes a leadership role leading up to the year 2000, when we, for whatever reason, created computers that didn't imagine we would make it to the year 2000. Those of us who are old enough remember this. It wasn't clear that the 19, when it moved to 1999, December 31st, that they wouldn't read it as 0000. And there were legitimate concerns about airplanes falling out of the sky and banking systems going to hell in a handbasket. There were rigorous UN efforts, billions of dollars put into this effort. Clock ticks, new millennium, 2000, things did happen. So people forget this. Things actually did happen. Some banking systems went down. Some military systems went offline for a little bit. Things got fixed, but it wasn't doomsday. Everyone wakes up on January 1st, slightly hungover, and says, what were all those people, you know, the younger Juliette, the pre-Juliette, why were they all freaking about, right? And everyone thinks of Y2K as this big nothing burger. Well, actually, there's a different story. So I tell that story to say, you know, that is a challenge, right? Is the better we are at failing safer, because we're not going to stop all bad things from happening. And in terms of our communication strategies, our redundancies, our ability to pivot, all the lessons I teach in the book through disaster studies, through looking at disasters and what happened, the harder it is to justify. And so thinking about ways that we can overcome the preparedness paradox. True to form, there was a fire truck outside my house, but I think it's for the apartment complex next door. So I'll let you know. I'll let you know if I hear some kids screaming. But and so
you can give the firemen coffee if they come in.
Exactly. So I mean, the more recent example, my favorite story out of the book, if I could take up, was the Fukushima one.
Sure.
Was the way in which we think about Fukushima, an earthquake, a massive tsunami, and a radiation leak. And we tend to view it as, well, nuclear facilities are, you know, inherently dangerous. And it had a huge impact on US policy, on the Democratic Party, essentially abandons nuclear energy investments after that. Germany abandons nuclear, putting it completely dependent on Russia. It is now returning to it during the war in Ukraine. And we tell that story of sort of, well, you know, bad things happen and then really bad things happen, like radiation leak. There's a whole bunch of reasons why Fukushima happened. I tell the story of the nuclear facility 30 miles away, closer to the water, more structurally damaged. Its leadership focused on failing safer. Fukushima's leadership thought that they could sell nuclear facilities by claiming that they were perfectly safe. Part of this is the legacy of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that the Japanese population is obviously very nervous about nuclear. The other facility owners trained, gave authority to the guys on the ground, and they were able to turn off the nuclear facility with enough time before the water comes in and made it impossible to control the radiation. No one knows about this other nuclear facility. So I want to turn people's gaze and say, okay, actually, there are investments we can make. And that nuclear facility is still closed. It is still damaged. It's not running anymore. But in a world in which I'm judging things by, can things be less bad? Fukushima has told us a story which isn't entirely true, right? That we actually can control some of these damages. And I know people are probably, you know, jaws drop, and I'm thinking about, you know, how do you make nuclear safer? But if we don't learn these lessons, we're gonna, one, fail miserably, but we're not going to see the connective tissue across centuries of disasters. They all end up honestly looking relatively the same, even though each is unique in its own way.
I don't want to get into it, but people who are opposed to nuclear power would say, well, the fact that it was closed down and still closed down suggests that's one of the things that's wrong with it. That's all you need to say. In any case, we don't want to go there. One of the things that you stress again and again, and it's really basic to your whole thinking, is that disasters are inevitable.
Yeah.
And consequently, we have no choice but to prepare for them.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the devil is agnostic, and in the left and right of boom framework that I was describing before, the investments before and after the boom, I'm agnostic about the boom. As I told you, my own narrative, I started off in counterterrorism, actually started off in civil rights, got into counterterrorism because of the nexus of counterterrorism efforts and civil rights, and then had a course correction in my own career in some ways in 2005 with Hurricane Katrina. Many of us in the field of Homeland Security, how do you think about democracies and how they can better protect themselves? Looked at New Orleans and said, wow, we spent a lot of money stopping 19 guys from getting on 4 airplanes again. That's great. Like we don't want that again, but we can't save an American city from drowning. So a lot of us in the field began to take the all hazards approach, which is I'm not going to focus too much on the individual distinctions, right, between cyber and public health and asteroids or, tsunamis or natural disasters or radicalization. Those are all each unique. I can talk. I'm a consumer of intelligence of all of those. I think about the threat environment, but also what's the ways in which we can better manage the consequences should any of the booms come to hit. And that's why, as I often wrote through COVID, because I was picked up by The Atlantic leading up to COVID, when editors from The Atlantic who knew my work started seeing my increasing panic, and I'm not one to panic very easily, in January, February of 2020, where I'm like, I'm not even a doctor and I'm getting nervous, right? So the way I wanted people to think about the pandemic was that while the virus was novel, the disaster management looked pretty much the same, right? You try to have, or good disaster management would have looked the same, right? In terms of communication strategy, data management, surging resources, localization of efforts as we needed in this case, and to put it into a sort of common framework.
I promised the audience that I would ask their questions, and I have received some from David, and don't hesitate to text him more if you want to. I'll ask as many of them as I can.
Great.
First of all, here's Carol. She wants to know why domestic terrorist groups are treated differently than those with a foreign connection.
Yeah.
She says investigations are different with each. Can that be changed?
It can be. I mean, we don't have a domestic terrorism federal statute that per se domestic terrorism, but let me tell you why. I don't say I'm very late on this. So part of it is just the history of the division, pre 9/11 division between foreign and domestic. We know those divisions are kind of fake now because we know of the nexus between the two, but those structures were built. But why I don't want to say I don't worry about it. If we had one, that would be good, but I don't think it hinders us as much as maybe some other people or commentators do. I mean, for one, is most of these domestic terror groups are so aligned with the anti-hate statutes. In other words, the hate of which your hate crime statutes will also cover. It is very rare not to, I mean, there's some that are purely political, but if you go after Q Club, right? Because whatever your history is, I don't really care. If you hate the LGBTQ community in Colorado Springs, you're maybe a domestic terrorist, right? Because you don't want the free expression of their movement or for them to thrive in a democracy. You're also violating a hate crime. So I think there's other federal statutes. Our seditious conspiracy statutes will cover the political crimes. But I also want people to think about there's a philosophy that some of us sometimes ascribe to, which is sometimes treating them as just criminals, right? Nothing fancy, nothing heroic. They're not special. Whoa, if they've got their ideologies, just put them in jail for murder, put them in jail for assault. That's what a lot of the January 6th stuff is, right? It is just assault charges. They are nothing. They are nothing, right? And you just treat them like the guy on the street. So there are of the things I worry about, not having that statute, I don't think hinders very much. And I think most people who are working it feel unhindered don't feel hindered that we don't have one.
Dorothea wants to know, do you think that Steve Bannon has a connection with this attempted coup? Or
yeah,
it wasn't attempted, it was talked about coup.
Yeah.
In Europe. He's traveled a lot in Europe.
Yeah, and he envisions in Hungary and elsewhere, he envisions a non-NATO, non-EU Europe in which the nationalist regimes take over each of these countries. He was, of course, Brexit and other movements. So when you say connection, like, do I think like he knew these guys? I don't know yet, right? But this is where this idea of connectivity and the idea of thinking about lone wolves or organizations as individual, it doesn't hold anymore in the 21st century. Do I believe that some of the people who did this likely know of his work, know what he wants. Yes, I'll put it that way. Do I think that they were on phone calls? I don't know.
Bruce and Paul are asking about the same kind of thing, which has to do with the people who are willing to buy conspiracy theories when facts seem to be irrelevant. How do we keep them from having outsized influence? How do we persuade them not to believe these things?
Yeah, so it's a great thing. So what's your off ramp? So there's a couple things. So one is to remember that your goal is not eradication. So what I was saying is, when I think about how do ideologies fail, they fail because they just can't get more oxygen. So we've likely seen the heyday of QAnon for a variety of reasons, certainly Proud Boys and Oath Keepers. It doesn't mean we don't keep our eyes on the prize, or that there's going to be people who still want to do that. It's just, you're just looking at the oxygen levels. When, Oren, I didn't answer your question when you asked me earlier, what do I think about Trump and QAnon? I wrote a piece for The Atlantic saying, that's all he's got. This is good news, people. This is good news. Because my worry a year ago was, if this guy keeps growing, he's got, the Chamber of Commerce, right? That then begins to make me nervous, because those are people who may not want to be affiliated with this stuff as they begin to accept it. So the fact that he had to reach down to QAnon is actually a sign that he has nothing. There's no establishment that he can hold on to. Whether that holds, we don't know in the election. But as I said, I like the metrics I'm seeing. And so, but the off ramp for individuals, say, who begin down this process, I'm not an expert on it. I've certainly read a lot in terms of the off ramping of QAnon. The only thing that actually works is individualized, familial, or friendship intervention that is not ignoring it, as many of us probably are want to do, but to recognize it early on, and then to provide forums for these people who are going further and further down. And a lot of it is the truth sandwich, right? So we talk about this in the media as well. Is if if Warren believes that Martians, are running the government for Biden, right? It is not repeating it and saying he's crazy, right? But trying to sandwich it into some truths that these people still believe, right? So, and that ends up being the individualized way. So there's both the societal way of isolation and shaming and deplatforming, and then the individual also becomes relevant to get friends and family off the quicksand. And you got to catch them early. You can't deny that it's happening to your family member, because it gets worse, not better.
Okay, here's EA who asks, what are your thoughts on possible foreign intervention in future American elections?
Yeah, so I think we're better at it. I really want to give credit to both the structures that were put in place during the Trump administration by, if you want to call them, the deep state, and then obviously the Biden administration. Russia's our biggest concern because it's cheap, and he is he's a former intelligence leader. He's brilliant at festering the divisions in our society. China and Iran we worry about next, and then North Korea, and don't forget China. China is in this game. So I think information is very easily manipulated. And I don't like what's happening at Twitter, because it actually had one of the strongest content moderation apparatus, or content moderation apparatuses. So I'm still on Twitter. I don't know how much longer, because content moderation is why we were there, right? That you could learn there. You didn't have to deal with the foreign influences. In terms of access to the physical structures of elections are a critical infrastructure, or voting is a critical infrastructure sector. It's really hard to do, partially because we're such a distributed democracy. We have something like we only have 50 states. We have something like over 3,000 election hubs and so it's just really hard to have an influence. What I worry about, honestly, is the two scenarios I've always worried about is, one is someone gets into AP. Associated Press is still recognized as the caller of elections. You would be amazed how much AP puts into its cybersecurity. it is the thing that they know will kill them, but could also kill democracy. Because the networks still go by the AP numbers. Everyone sort of has a reliance on them. So one would be, no one trusts the numbers, left or right. The other is, think about in a close race in Michigan, if you're Russia and you want the MAGA person, let's say it's a Trump or someone else, to win, how do you suppress the votes in Detroit? Well, you can bring down other critical infrastructure. You could bring down the signals. You can do reverse 911 and say that there's active shooters. You can claim that there's a fire sweeping through Detroit, whatever it is, to cause disruption that might get 10,000 African Americans not to vote. And then maybe you swung the election. It's always the sort of other things that I had worried about. And if you think about what Russia might do, knowing that we fortified the elections, they're gonna find a third, fourth, or fifth way to try to do it. And so I look to the other things that they might disrupt that would have an impact on voting. To their credit, both parties, but in particular Democrats, obviously, have filings ready in each state for that contingency, so that you would extend voting, if there was a disruption like that.
What would Russia want to accomplish? There's reports that what Vladimir Putin wanted to do with Donald Trump had to do with his concerns about Ukraine. Suppose he goes away, the Ukraine issue isn't there anymore. What Russia? Why would Russia, or why would China, or why would anybody else want to disrupt American elections?
So one is because they can't look. Let me do China, because Russia is a little bit different in terms of his, that was a superpower on decline. He had limited resources. He's not a rich country. He doesn't, no one needs Russia, right? We don't particularly need Russia's market or anything. So he's doing it for, in some ways, some relevance. Some of it may have to do with foreign policy, and some may just have to be making our democracy look bad. I think China is a little bit different. China, and until COVID, so these protests in China are really interesting. China was providing to the world a narrative that we thought during the Cold War was impossible, that you could have a free market with limited freedoms for your citizens. And the image of America, with our race issues and our police brutality and our inability to take a vaccine to save our neighbors, the madness benefited that narrative for China for a variety of reasons. They just seemed more stable. They seemed more reliable, right? So it's really interesting what's happening in China now. Their zero COVID policy is a joke. It is likely was enforced because China did not want to admit that their own vaccine was limited in its effectiveness, and they didn't want to import from the United States or American companies, and so basically decided we're going to do it this way. So that doesn't work. One, it didn't work, right? I mean, in other words, they still have high infection rates from what we know. And lo and behold, then, at least people that I read who I believe in terms of putting the chronology together, the World Cup begins in Qatar. And Chinese who are stuck in their house are looking at their TVs and saying, why the heck is the world out partying and I'm not allowed to? And the protests begin that first weekend. And I think that, and now China has relented. So it's a very interesting counter to what China was playing with us with all of our noisiness with Trump. So that's what I think China wants. China wants the alternative vision of a free market and an economic juggernaut. You don't have to give people freedoms.
Judge Joe wants to know, what is your assessment of the Biden administration's ability to deal with a significant natural disaster, whether it's hate-related or not?
Natural disaster?
Natural disaster or a hate-related disaster.
So I think on the hate stuff, I think he says all the right things. He may not say it in the tone that we're used to with Obama. We're certainly better than Trump, but that his language is not as flowery. But what's interesting is,
well, he says the right things, but what can he do?
So I mean, the resources and the focus by the FBI is clear now that they're focused on this issue. They've got, I don't want to say something like 15% to 85% focus on foreign threats in the United States versus domestic right now. They are well aware. They continue the investigations, and it's whether it resonates long term, we don't know. Is it going to disrupt these groups from continuing to try to form? What you try to do is just limit their ability to plan large scale events. I know it sounds like I'm giving up. I'm not. It's just that the smaller scale events are really, really hard to prevent. And so you want to stop the means that these become effective. So the focus on gun control and other issues, which I think are really.
So what about the next tsunami or the whatever the natural disaster happens to be?
I mean, their response on natural disasters, I think, has been relatively good. I thought, and a hurricane, let's just say Hurricane Ian, right? That's going to be a $500 billion disaster across Florida. The biggest problem is, of course, the late evacuation call in Lee County. I think that's where most of the deaths occurred. This is not something that a White House can change. And I think what you want to focus on is, are they delivering resources fast enough? And I think the answer is yes. What isn't getting solved, and I think the Biden administration is guilty of this, as every administration before it is our response and recovery system built for the kind of world we need to live in an age of climate disasters? The answer is no, because we pay people to go back to where they were before. And in California, there was a huge debate about managed retreat in Paradise and other places. Why are we paying people to go back to these places? I mean, I'm kind of hardcore about this. Our disaster relief funding should be conditioned on accepting that some places are more vulnerable than others, and beginning to condition that money. There is talk about that in the administration and certainly emergency managers, but not enough is being done fast enough.
Well, nobody wants to get up in Congress and say you can't go home.
These people don't deserve their money, right? So ways to do it is you basically condition it before the next disaster, because there will be another disaster, and say, if we did it after Hurricane Sandy. It was done rather quietly, but you're essentially just paying people to move 100 feet back, right? And everyone's like, oh, my home, my home. But honestly, if you do it right, we've seen it in other cultures and parts of the United States. Most people want to protect their family. I mean, a house is a house. Most people love their children. They recognize that they are at risk.
Strategic withdrawal is what you call it in the book,
yes.
And people talk about that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That it is managed retreat or strategic withdrawal. You accept the devil's win in that instance, and you rethink your systems of disaster relief in light of the victory. In this case, there are just places that we ought not to be living.
And we should try to impose then limitations on people. How do we keep them away? What if they want to go there?
Well, look, the governments have lots of tools to require, to raise the floor, right? You have carrots and sticks, a tax rebates or a tax system or penalty systems, regulation, zoning, all the things that we do to make sure that that schools are in certain zones or whatever. We can use those focused on climate resiliency, and we don't, because once again, our entire disaster relief system is built on the idea that disaster was a fluke. We'll pay people, because we feel bad for them, to let them get back, right? Get back. What does that mean? Why? Honestly, why? Right? We got to get them to move back, or to leave the dead end streets in Paradise, California, wherever we're talking about.
All right, the listeners have asked some great questions. The viewers, I should say, have asked some great questions. I could go on for a very long time with you.
Me too.
But we're down to the point where we only have about a minute left or so,
Okay.
and I want to give you an opportunity to say anything you want.
I'm, as you can tell, I'm a semi-optimistic person. I got high energy. I live in this world of sort of less bad and failing safe. So I want to just talk about the title of the book very quickly, because I always like to end with just thinking about human agency. If you think about that, we're just at the mercy of the misalignment of the stars. It gives us no capacity. So the book's title, The Devil Never Sleeps, Learning to Live in an Age of Disasters, comes from a woman I met in Joplin, Missouri, very devout Christian woman, very conservative. I was in the Obama administration at the time. I met her. I then see, so Joplin, over 100 people died in a 19-second tornado that wipes through a small devout town. I see her a year later. She's helping rebuild, get Joplin ready for the next tornado. She's happy. Her faith has guided her. Her faith is not a faith of oh, God has its way. It's a faith of agency. I loved it. It is, God put us on this earth to do better. So I said, how are you like this? And she said, I live in Missouri. There's going to be more tornadoes. The devil never sleeps. But he only wins if we don't do better next time. And it's a way of thinking about learning to fail safer, because if we judge, because we do have that agency, however bad things are, we are a remarkable species regardless, compared to the alternative, I guess I would say.
Juliette Kayyam, thank you so much. We don't need
Thank
any
you.
alternatives to you. You're delightful to be with us, and thank you so much again for doing
Thank you
it.
so much, everyone.
Next Wednesday on December 14th, it's going to be Bill Kristol and Ron Brownstein with KPCC's Larry Mantle. Kristol is, of course, among the intellectual godfathers of the Never Trump movement. Brownstein is a very perceptive, very sober analyst of political trends. That'll be next week, Wednesday, December 14th, 5 o'clock Pacific time, as always. Thank you for watching this time. Stay healthy, be safe.